The waitress signed "You're welcome" to a quiet customer, and the vampire king in the corner booth started crying. Everyone thought she'd insulted royalty. What they didn't know, his mute son had never had a conversation with a stranger before, and the king would burn his kingdom down before he let this woman leave. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Maya's hands ached in that deep bone way that meant she'd carried too many trays for too many hours, and her lower back sent up its usual complaints as she approached table 7 with her practiced server smile already fixed in place. The meridian on a Friday night was always intense, but tonight had been particularly brutal. 3 separate parties running late and overlapping with the dinner rush, which meant she'd been moving at near sprint for the past 6 hours with only one quick break to wolf down some bread in the kitchen. The tips were good though, worth the pain, and she was so close to having enough saved for the graduate program application fees that she could almost taste it, could almost see herself in a classroom learning the clinical side of speech pathology instead of just using ASL to communicate with the handful of deaf regulars who came to the Meridian because she worked here. Table 7 had been seated 20 minutes ago and she'd noticed them earlier, but hadn't been assigned to their section until Jennifer went home sick, leaving Maya to cover the entire east wing of the dining room. The teenager sat with his shoulders hunched inward, dark hair falling across his face as he stared at the leather-bound menu with an expression Maya recognized immediately because she'd seen it 1,000 times, that particular flavor of frustration mixed with resignation that came from being unable to access something everyone else took for granted. His companion, a severe-looking man in his 50s wearing a suit that probably cost more than Maya's monthly rent, had his phone pressed to his ear and was speaking in rapid, clipped tones that suggested he found both the call and the boy equally tedious. Maya moved closer and saw the teenager's fingers twitch against the menu edge, a tiny aborted movement that looked like it wanted to be a sign. And she made her decision without really thinking about it because this was what she did. This was why she'd learned ASL in the first place back in high school, when her best friend's little brother had started losing his hearing. She stepped into the boy's line of sight, and her hands moved almost automatically, signing, "Can I help?" with a questioning tilt to her head and a genuine smile that had nothing to do with customer service and everything to do with the small joy of connection. The boy's head snapped up and his eyes went wide, so wide she could see the whites all around his irises, and for a heartbeat he just stared at her like she'd performed some kind of miracle. Then his hands flew up and he signed back, "Yes, please," movements quick and eager and slightly desperate. And Maya felt her smile widen into something real as she pulled out her order pad and signed "What would you like?" while speaking aloud for the benefit of the severe man who was still on his phone. The boy's face had transformed completely, gone from that resigned frustration to something bright and alive and almost painfully hopeful. And he signed, "I don't know what's good," no one explained, his movements precise, but with an odd formality that suggested either very careful training or not much practice with casual conversation. Maya glanced at the menu and signed back. "The salmon is fresh tonight, chef's recommendation," her hands moving through the familiar patterns while her mind registered that this kid had clearly been sitting here for 20 minutes unable to ask basic questions about food. She added, "And the risotto is excellent if you like mushrooms," noting the way his eyes tracked her hands like they were the most important thing in the world. He signed, "No one ever asks me," and then "Thank you." The last sign held a beat longer than necessary, and something in Maya's chest tightened because there was so much weight in those simple signs, so much lonely gratitude for something she did without thinking. The severe man had ended his call and was watching their interaction with an expression Maya couldn't quite read, something between surprise and calculation. But the boy was signing again, asking, "Is the pasta good?" and Maya was responding when she felt it, that prickling awareness of being watched by someone other than her immediate customers. She turned slightly, still signing her response about the chef's special carbonara, and her gaze landed on the corner booth she'd barely registered before. The man sitting there was older than the severe suit wearer, somewhere in that ageless space between 40 and 60, with silver threading through dark hair and a face that would have been almost cruelly beautiful, except for the tears running down his cheeks. He wasn't moving, wasn't making a sound, but tears were streaming steadily from eyes that held an expression of such raw, unguarded pain that Maya actually took a step backward, her hands freezing mid-sign. The severe man snapped to attention immediately, his phone clattering onto the table as he half rose from his seat. And Maya suddenly became aware that the quiet murmur of conversation throughout the dining room had died completely. Other diners had turned toward the corner booth, their faces blank and still in a way that made her skin prickle, and she realized with a lurch of fear that she'd somehow violated some unspoken rule she didn't even know existed. The crying man stood slowly, and every head in the room bowed, not dramatically, but with a subtle downward tilt that spoke of ingrained deference. And Maya felt her heart start hammering because she'd worked at the Meridian for 3 years and had never seen anything like this. The man's eyes, still wet with tears, locked onto Maya's face, and he spoke one word in a voice rough with emotion: "Stay." It wasn't a request. Maya's manager appeared at her elbow so quickly it was like he'd materialized from thin air, and his face had gone the color of old paste, that greenish white that meant either illness or pure terror. He leaned close and whispered directly into her ear, his breath hot against her skin. "You just signed to the Vampire King's son, and the king himself wants to speak with you now." And Maya's mind went briefly, completely blank. Vampire. King. The words didn't connect to reality, except she was looking at a room full of people who were holding themselves with that predator stillness she'd noticed before, but dismissed as just the particular tension of wealthy diners, and the severe man was looking at her with what might have been pity or assessment, or both. The boy, the king's son apparently, was signing something frantically, but Maya couldn't process it, because her manager had his hand on her elbow and was guiding her toward the corner booth with the kind of careful, deliberate movements you'd use approaching a dangerous animal. The crying man, the king, hadn't wiped his face, and the tears kept coming in a slow, steady stream that seemed to surprise him as much as it terrified Maya. She stopped a few feet from the booth, close enough to see that his eyes were an impossible shade of amber that seemed to catch and hold the candlelight, and he studied her face with an intensity that made her want to simultaneously run and freeze in place. "You speak his language," he said, and his voice had that same roughness, like he was speaking around something painful in his throat. Maya's own voice came out smaller than she wanted, shaky and uncertain. "Ah, yes. American Sign Language, lots of people." But the king was already shaking his head slowly. "No one here does," he said, and now there was something almost wondering in his tone beneath the grief. "In 200 years only his tutor has spoken to my son." The numbers didn't make sense, couldn't make sense, except Maya was looking at the teenager who was still signing frantically at the severe man, his movements getting bigger and more emphatic, and she could see now that his skin had a quality to it that was almost translucent in the candlelight, too perfect to be entirely human. The piano music that had been playing softly in the background cut off mid-note, and the silence that rushed in to fill it felt heavy and expectant, like the air before a thunderstorm. The king took a step closer, and Maya forced herself not to retreat, even though every instinct was screaming at her to run, because he'd smiled, just a tiny flicker of expression when he looked past her at his son, and something about that smile had been heartbreaking in its tenderness, so at odds with the tears and the terror that Maya felt her fear complicated by something she absolutely should not be feeling toward a vampire king. "How long have you known sign language?" he asked, still not wiping his face, and Maya managed to force words past the tightness in her throat. 10 years, since high school. I'm saving for grad school in speech pathology." Something shifted in his expression at that, some kind of calculation happening behind those impossible eyes, and he nodded once, as if she'd confirmed something important. The boy had given up on the severe man, and was signing at Maya again. Big obvious movements meant to be seen across the room, father cries never, and Maya looked back at the king just in time to see him turn slightly away, his jaw tight. The Meridian's owner, Mr. Chen, had materialized near the booth and was speaking in low, deferential tones to someone Maya couldn't see, and she caught the words, "Your Majesty, and whatever you need," and realized with a sick lurch that the vampire hierarchy she'd always dismissed as urban legend was not only real, but apparently centered right here in her city. The king looked back at her, and now his tears had finally stopped, but the tracks they'd left on his face caught the light like scars. "You gave my son something I could not," he said quietly, and there was so much raw emotion in those words that Maya felt her throat close up. The severe man had approached and was watching Maya with clinical detachment like she was a specimen to be examined and catalogued, and she knew somehow that he was assessing whether she was a threat or a tool or something else entirely. The other diners remained frozen in their seats, no one eating or drinking or even seeming to breathe, and Maya understood that whatever was happening right now was significant in ways she couldn't begin to comprehend. Her hands were trembling slightly when she signed to the boy across the room. "You're welcome." The conversation was nice, and his face lit up again with that painful hope. The king's eyes tracked her hands and then returned to her face, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted into something harder, more controlled. "We need to talk about the future, about what you can offer, and what I can give in return." And Maya realized that her simple act of kindness had just pulled her into a world she'd never wanted to enter, a world where vampires were real, and kings cried, and lonely boys went centuries without conversation. A world where her careful plans for graduate school and a normal life had just become infinitely more complicated than she'd ever imagined. Maya had taken 2 buses and spent $43 on an Uber. She absolutely could not afford to reach Thornwood Estate, watching the houses get progressively larger and farther apart as the driver wound through streets that didn't appear on Google Maps with their usual accuracy. The estate itself appeared suddenly around a curve, iron gates that were somehow both elegant and threatening rising 15 feet high. Cameras mounted at intervals that suggested military-grade security rather than simple home protection. The guard who checked her ID moved with that same eerie smoothness she'd noticed in the diners at the Meridian, too fluid to be entirely human, and Maya felt her pulse kick up as the gates swung open silently, to reveal a driveway that curved through manicured grounds for what had to be at least a quarter-mile. The mansion at the end looked like something transplanted from a European estate, all stone and tall windows and architectural details that spoke of centuries rather than decades. And Maya clutched her worn messenger bag tighter as the Uber driver let out a low whistle and said, "Lady, whatever job interview this is, you better nail it." She wanted to laugh because job interview was such an inadequate term for whatever she was walking into. But her throat was too tight, and her hands were already sweating as she climbed the stone steps to doors that were easily 12 feet tall. A woman in a severe black dress opened them before Maya could knock, introducing herself as Mrs. Hendricks, the head of household staff, and led Maya through a foyer with marble floors and a chandelier that probably cost more than Maya would earn in 5 years of waitressing. The interior was exactly what Maya had expected, and somehow worse. All dark wood and priceless art, and the kind of quiet that came from rooms too large and too empty, like walking through a museum after hours. Mrs. Hendricks brought her to a sitting room where Dorian waited, standing by windows that overlooked gardens too perfect to be real. And when he turned to face her, Maya felt that same jolt of fear and attraction she'd experienced at the restaurant, his face carved into an expression of controlled courtesy that didn't quite hide something rawer underneath. He gestured to a chair and Maya sat, forcing herself not to perch nervously on the edge even though every instinct screamed at her to stay ready to run. The severe man from the restaurant, Marcus apparently, stood slightly behind and to the left of Dorian's chair, and Maya noticed he was positioned to observe both her and the door simultaneously. Dorian began speaking without preamble, his voice formal and precise as he outlined an offer that made Maya's head spin. Live on the estate as Lucien's companion and tutor, teach him to navigate the human world and expand his sign language and help him connect with others. $200,000 annually, plus room and board, and all expenses covered. The numbers were obscene, more money than Maya had ever imagined earning, more money than her mother had made in the best 3 years of her nursing career combined. Marcus produced a leather folder from somewhere and placed it on the low table between them, opening it to reveal a contract that had to be at least 47 pages long, dense legal text in a font size that suggested no one expected it to be actually read. Maya stared at the pages and felt something cold settle in her stomach, because she'd signed contracts before for student loans and apartment leases, and she knew that thickness meant clauses and subclauses and obligations she couldn't begin to untangle without help. And she looked up at Dorian and found him watching her with an expression of polite expectation, clearly anticipating immediate agreement, and something in Maya bristled at that assumption despite her terror. "I need time to read this," she said, her voice steadier than she felt, and watched surprise flicker across his face before his features smoothed back into neutrality. Marcus made a small sound that might have been disapproval, but Dorian raised one hand slightly, and the room fell into absolute silence. "How much time?" Dorian asked, and Maya thought about her work schedule and her pathetic free hours, and said 3 days, half expecting him to refuse or laugh or simply compel her agreement through whatever supernatural means vampires possessed. Instead, he studied her face for a long moment and then inclined his head. 3 days, then, and Maya felt a small shock of victory that he'd actually agreed. Mrs. Hendricks appeared to escort her out, moving through hallways that Maya tried and failed to memorize, and they were nearly to the front doors when Lucian appeared in a doorway to their left. He was wearing casual clothes, jeans, and a sweater that looked expensive but comfortable, and his face lit up when he saw Maya before falling into something more cautious and hopeful. His hands moved in quick, precise signs, "Please stay, please." And Maya felt her chest constrict because there was so much naked need in those simple signs, so much lonely desperation from a boy who'd spent 2 centuries without conversation. She signed back, "I'm thinking about it, I promise," and watched his face cycle through relief and anxiety before Mrs. Hendricks gently but firmly guided Maya toward the exit. The Uber ride back cost another $43, and Maya spent it staring at her phone, pulled up Google before she could second-guess herself, and typed in Dorian Ashford. The results were surprisingly sparse for someone of apparent wealth. Just sanitized PR about philanthropic donations and charity boards. A few society page mentions from the 80s and 90s, references to old money and inherited fortune, but nothing concrete about source or amount. She tried adding vampire to the search and found herself tumbling down a rabbit hole of forums and Reddit threads, people debating whether the Treaty of 1842 was real or urban legend, whether the King of the North American Covenant actually existed or was just a boogeyman story vampires told to keep younger ones in line. She found a grainy photograph dated 1924, a group of men in period dress standing in front of what looked like a government building, and her blood went cold because the man third from the left was unmistakably Dorian, same face, same bearing, looking exactly as he had 3 hours ago in his sitting room. She found 3 news articles spanning 60 years about people who died or disappeared after allegedly crossing someone powerful in the supernatural community, all officially ruled accidents or suicides, all containing the same phrase in witness statements. He simply looked at them and they knew. Maya's hands were shaking when she got home to the apartment she shared with Jess, who took one look at her face and demanded the full story. Maya told her everything while Jess's eyes got progressively wider. And when Maya finished, her roommate said flatly, "You cannot be seriously considering this. He's a literal vampire king and you'd be living in his house. Maya wanted to argue, wanted to explain that it was more complicated than that, but instead she pulled out her student loan statements with their cheerful projections of 30 years of payments, her credit card bills with their minimum payments she could barely make, and the eviction notice she'd been hiding in her desk drawer giving them 30 days to pay 3 months back rent or leave. Jess went quiet, looking at the numbers, and finally said, "Okay, I get why you're tempted, but Maya, this is insane. People who cross him disappear." Maya knew she was right, knew that taking this job was probably the worst decision she could make, but she also knew she was going to do it anyway because the alternative was dropping out of school and moving back to her mother's apartment in a town with no opportunities and watching all her careful plans for the future dissolve into nothing. She spent 2 days reading the contract, looking up legal terms she didn't understand, making notes in the margins about clauses that seemed particularly restrictive or vague. On November 10th at 2:14 in the afternoon, she returned to Thornwood Estate with a handwritten list of 12 amendments she wanted, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Marcus answered the door himself this time, and his face when he saw her list went through several expressions, shock and disapproval, and something that might have been reluctant respect. He led her back to Dorian's study, a room she hadn't seen before with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a desk that looked older than the country, afternoon light filtering through heavy curtains in a way that made the dust motes visible in the air. The room smelled like leather and old paper and pipe tobacco, should have felt warm and lived in, but instead felt like a museum exhibit, carefully preserved but not actually inhabited. Dorian rose when she entered and gestured to a chair across from his desk, and Maya sat down and slid her list across the polished wood before she could lose her nerve. She watched his face as he read, saw his eyebrows rise slightly at Amendment 3, his mouth tighten at Amendment 7, and when he finished he looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "No one negotiates with the king," Marcus said from his position by the door, his voice hard with disapproval, but Dorian held up one hand and Marcus fell silent immediately. "Amendment 7, Dorian said, reading aloud. "I maintain my own bank account and outside friendships," and then he looked at Maya with those impossible amber eyes. "You believe I would isolate you," he said, and it wasn't quite a question. Maya forced herself to hold his gaze and said, "Your son is isolated. I don't know if that's protection or prison." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and Marcus actually took a step forward before Dorian made a sharp gesture that froze him in place. Dorian's hand tightened on her list, the paper crinkling slightly under his fingers, and Maya watched the muscles in his jaw work as if he was physically forcing words back. Marcus started to speak, but Dorian waved him silent without looking away from Maya's face. And when he finally spoke, his voice was carefully controlled. "Agreed." They went through the rest of the list, and Dorian accepted 11 of the 12 amendments, refusing only her request for freedom to discuss this arrangement with press or media, explaining in a tone that brooked no argument that the secrecy of vampire existence was not negotiable, and violations would be met with severe consequences for both parties. Maya's hands were steady as she signed the amended contract, her signature looking small and ordinary next to Dorian's elaborate script, and she was capping her pen when the study door opened and Lucian entered, carrying something wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. He moved hesitantly, clearly unsure of his welcome, and Dorian's entire posture softened in a way that made Maya's throat tight. Lucian approached and held out the package to Maya with both hands, a formal gesture that felt rehearsed, and when she unwrapped it she found a hardcover book on ASL poetry, expensive and new and clearly chosen with care. Lucian's hands moved in signs that were deliberate and meaningful. "Thank you for seeing me." And Maya realized with a sinking feeling in her stomach that he thought she was doing this for him, that her motivation was kindness, or compassion, or connection, rather than the brutal practicality of money and survival. She signed back, "You're welcome." I'm happy to help, and watched his face transform into pure joy, the first time she'd seen him without some shadow of sadness or loneliness, and the weight of that misunderstanding settled onto her shoulders like a physical thing. Dorian was watching the exchange with an expression of such careful hope that Maya had to look away, suddenly unable to bear the vulnerability in his face, and she gathered her copy of the contract and the book and stood on shaking legs. Amendment 4, Marcus said suddenly from the door, his voice neutral but his eyes sharp. Grants you freedom of movement on estate grounds and in Chicago proper between 6 a.m. and 10 p.m. The time limits are for your protection and are not negotiable. Maya nodded, noting the emphasis, understanding that she was being warned about something, but not quite sure what. Dorian walked her to the study door, and for a moment they stood close enough that Maya could smell something like cedar and old smoke, could see the impossible smoothness of his skin, and the way the light seemed to catch differently on him than on living things. The king's protection is absolute, he said quietly, but it comes with absolute rules. Learn them quickly. Maya nodded again and let Mrs. Hendricks lead her back through the maze of hallways toward the front entrance, passing rooms full of furniture draped in sheets and portraits of people in period dress and mirrors that she suddenly realized showed her reflection but nothing else, empty spaces where Dorian should have been visible but wasn't. She had 1 week to move her things into Thornwood Estate, 1 week to say goodbye to her normal life, and step into whatever waited behind those iron gates. And as the Uber driver pulled away, Maya looked back at the mansion and saw Lucian in an upper window, watching her leave with his hand pressed against the glass. Maya's third day at Thornwood Estate had started with unexpected laughter, the kind that bubbled up genuine and unforced, while she and Lucien sat in the garden learning what he called vampire sign language, which was apparently different from ASL in ways that fascinated her professionally and unsettled her personally. VSL had signs for concepts that shouldn't exist. Blood debt signed with a gesture that mimicked drawing a knife across the palm. Covenant law signed with interlocked fingers that suggested binding and imprisonment. Eternal night signed with hands moving in a circle that never closed. Lucian was more animated than she'd seen him, his hands flying through explanations, occasionally laughing when Maya misunderstood and accidentally signed something inappropriate like blood drunk instead of blood oath. The afternoon sun was warm on her shoulders, and the garden smelled like late roses and something herbal she couldn't identify. And for the first time since signing that contract, Maya felt like maybe this could actually work. Like maybe she could give this lonely boy something real and walk away in a year with enough money to build the future she wanted. She'd noticed Dorian in his office window earlier, just a shadow behind glass, watching them with that same careful stillness he seemed to carry everywhere. But she'd pushed away the flutter of awareness in her stomach and focused on Lucien's explanation of the sign for sanctuary. They were practicing formal greetings, the kind used between vampires of different status levels, when Marcus appeared on the garden path moving faster than she'd ever seen him move. His usual controlled demeanor fractured into something almost like urgency. He carried a tablet, and his face had gone tight with an emotion Maya couldn't read, anger or fear or both, and Lucien's hands froze mid-sign as Marcus approached. The tablet screen showed a TMZ article with a headline in aggressive caps, "Mystery Woman Moves into Vampire King's Estate, New Queen," and below it, a telephoto shot of Maya and Lucian in this exact garden, taken from an angle that suggested someone with a very expensive camera had been positioned in the trees beyond the estate walls. The article text was breathless speculation about Dorian Ashford's reclusive lifestyle and mysterious fortune, about the young woman seen moving into his private residence 3 days ago, about what this might mean for the notoriously single billionaire. Maya felt her stomach drop because the photo made them look intimate, Lucien's head thrown back in laughter, and Maya leaning close with her hand on his shoulder. And the caption read, "Ashford's new love teaching his son sign language. Sources say the relationship moved quickly." She looked up at Marcus and saw him already swiping to show more articles, Page 6 and some vampire gossip blog she'd never heard of, and a Reddit thread that had accumulated 400 comments in 2 hours. Within an hour, the estate's perimeter cameras showed cars lining the road beyond the gates, photographers with long lenses and people who moved with that predator smoothness, setting up positions in the woods. Marcus gestured sharply, and Maya and Lucian followed him inside, through hallways that suddenly felt less like a mansion and more like a fortress, up to Dorian's office, where the king stood at his desk staring at multiple screens showing security footage. He didn't turn when they entered, but Maya saw his shoulders tense, saw his hands flatten against the desk hard enough that she heard wood creak. And when he finally looked at her, his face was carved into an expression of rage so controlled it was almost worse than if he'd been shouting. Marcus moved to the desk and began pulling up more feeds, cameras showing the perimeter breach, and the paparazzi, and 3 black cars with plates Maya didn't recognize parked outside the gates, like they had every right to be there. Covenant diplomatic plates, Marcus said flatly. And Dorian's jaw tightened further. Maya wanted to ask what that meant, but Marcus was already talking, his voice clipped and professional, as he explained that under Covenant law, if Dorian was perceived to have a human consort, she must be formally presented to the Covenant Council within 72 hours and pass their worthiness trial or be removed permanently. The word removed landed in the room like a physical weight, and Maya felt ice spread through her chest because she understood euphemism when she heard it. Understood that removed meant killed. Dorian started pacing, a movement so agitated and unlike his usual controlled stillness that Maya took an involuntary step back, and his voice when he spoke was rough with fury directed entirely at himself. I didn't anticipate this. I haven't taken anyone into my home in a century so I forgot the Covenant's interest in my private life. Maya found her voice finally, and it came out harder than she intended. You said I'd be safe here. And Dorian stopped pacing to look at her with an expression that was part guilt and part something rawer. From external threats, he said. I didn't anticipate internal politics would move this quickly. Marcus pulled up another screen and began reading in that same professional tone, outlining the trial's 3 parts with the detachment of someone describing a weather forecast rather than potential torture. The loyalty test, he said, ensures the human has no hidden agenda or external allegiances that could compromise Covenant security. The pain threshold test, he continued, demonstrates the human's ability to keep secrets under duress. And the reveal, he finished, proves the human understands the true nature of what they've entered and accepts the consequences. Maya's mouth had gone dry and she had to force the question out. What does that mean? The pain threshold test. And Marcus looked at Dorian, who had turned away to stare at the rain-streaked windows. It involves silver and fire, Dorian said quietly. Vampire weaknesses used to test human resolve, to ensure you won't break under pressure and expose our existence. Maya felt the room tilt slightly and grabbed the back of a chair to steady herself, trying to process that she was being told she'd be tortured to prove she could keep secrets. Secrets she'd only learned 3 days ago about a world she'd never asked to enter. And if I fail, she asked, and her voice sounded distant to her own ears. Dorian turned back, and his face was carefully blank, except for his eyes, which held something that looked almost like grief. The Covenant has the right to demand execution or memory wipe, he said. You would forget, Lucien. Forget all of this. Go back to your life as it was. Lucien made a sound like a wounded animal and his hands flew up in frantic signs. No, no! I'll tell them to leave her alone. I'll explain she's just my tutor. I'll make them understand. Dorian's hands moved in response, slower and deliberate, signing, You have no authority with them. I'm sorry. And Maya watched the boy's face crumple as he understood his powerlessness. The office felt smaller than it had minutes ago, the walls closer, the air thinner. And Maya became aware of just how trapped she was with rain hammering the windows and security feeds showing people surrounding the estate and 3 black cars with diplomatic plates waiting for her inevitable surrender. She thought about the contract in her room upstairs with all her careful amendments. the exit clause she'd been so proud of negotiating, and realized with bitter clarity that it meant nothing now because she couldn't leave in 2 weeks or 2 months or ever if the covenant decided she knew too much. You said the contract would protect me, she said, and heard how small her voice sounded. Dorian crossed to her in 2 long strides and for a moment stood close enough that she could see the muscle jumping in his jaw, could smell that cedar and smoke scent, could see that his hands were trembling slightly with controlled rage. The contract protects you from me, he said, from my taking advantage or making demands beyond what we agreed. But it can't protect you from covenant law, which supersedes any personal agreement I make. Marcus cleared his throat, and both Maya and Dorian turned to look at him, and his expression was something between satisfaction and genuine concern. I warned against this arrangement, he said to Dorian, and Dorian's eyes flashed with anger, but he didn't argue. Marcus pulled up another file on his tablet and began reading in that same detached tone. The last human who stood trial was in 1987. Officially, she chose the memory wipe and returned to her previous life. Unofficially, there were rumors she didn't survive the pain threshold test and the memory wipe was the story told to avoid questions. Maya felt her knees go weak and sat heavily in the chair she'd been gripping, her mind trying and failing to find an exit from this trap she'd walked into, with her eyes wide open, chasing money and security and a future that now seemed impossibly distant. The Covenant Council meets in 72 hours, Marcus continued. November 14th at 8 p.m., you'll be required to present yourself and undergo the trial. Failure to appear will be considered an admission of hostile intent and dealt with accordingly. Maya looked at Dorian and found him staring at her with an intensity that made her skin prickle, and she realized that she was now his in the Covenant's eyes, whether either of them wanted that or not, that her presence in his home had created an intimacy that existed in vampire law regardless of actual relationship. What happens if I pass? She asked, and Marcus and Dorian exchanged a look that made her stomach clench. If you pass, Dorian said carefully, you'll be recognized as under my protection, bound to Thornwood Estate and Covenant law, your movements and associations monitored, your life fundamentally changed in ways we cannot fully explain until after the trial. So either way, I lose my freedom, Maya said, and it wasn't really a question. Dorian moved to the windows and pressed one hand against the glass, his reflection not appearing in the rain-streaked surface, and when he spoke, his voice was so low she almost didn't hear it. I never meant for this, he said. I only wanted to give my son what I couldn't. I didn't think about the cost to you. Lucian had collapsed into a chair and was signing to himself, repetitive movements that looked almost like prayer or panic. And Maya felt something crack in her chest, because this boy had been alone for 200 years and had finally found connection only to have it threatened by the same political structure that had isolated him in the first place. The security feeds showed more cars arriving, more cameras, and Marcus began identifying the various Covenant factions represented by the diplomatic plates, explaining in his clinical way which council members were likely sympathetic and which would push for the harshest interpretation of the law. Rain hammered harder against the windows, and somewhere in the house, Maya heard a door slam. Maybe just wind, but maybe something else. And she thought about the garden where she and Lucian had been laughing less than 2 hours ago, how quickly safety had transformed into threat. Can you prepare me, she asked Dorian, for the trial? Can you tell me what to expect so I have a chance? And he turned from the window with tears running down his face exactly like that first night at the Meridian, grief and rage, and something that looked almost like love warring in his expression. I can try, he said, but Maya, the trial is designed to break people, designed to ensure only those with absolute loyalty and inhuman pain tolerance survive. I can prepare you for the questions, but I cannot prepare you for what they'll do to get answers. Marcus pulled up more files, historical records of previous trials with clinical descriptions of techniques used, and Maya forced herself to read, even as her hands started shaking, forced herself to understand exactly what she'd agreed to when she'd signed that contract and moved into this beautiful prison. Lucian had stopped signing to himself and was watching her with eyes that held both hope and terrible guilt. And Maya knew he was blaming himself for her situation, knew he was trying to figure out how to save her from consequences of his own loneliness. The office had gone dark except for the glow of the security screens, rain and night pressing against the windows, and Maya sat in a circle of lamplight, realizing that the choice she'd made 3 days ago to trade her time and skills for money and security had actually been a choice to step into a world with rules she didn't understand and powers she couldn't fight. A world where Dorian's authority couldn't shield her from his own people's paranoia, and where her careful exit clause meant nothing, because the only exit now was death or forgetting, and she wasn't sure which one terrified her more. The morning of November 12th arrived cold and gray, frost etching patterns on the windows of Dorian's study, where Maya sat across from him at 10 a.m. exactly, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago while he explained in clinical, merciless detail exactly what the Covenant trial would do to her body and mind. He'd been talking for 90 minutes straight, his voice never wavering from that professional detachment, even as he described the loyalty test's compulsion magic, how it would feel like hooks in her mind, dragging truth to the surface, whether she wanted to speak or not, how any deception or hidden agenda would register as physical pain that increased until she either confessed or passed out. Maya forced herself to keep her eyes on his face while he moved to the second test, the pain threshold evaluation, and his hands were perfectly steady as he explained that she would be exposed to silver burns in controlled increments to prove she wouldn't break under vampire interrogation methods, that the Covenant needed assurance she could withstand torture without revealing their existence to human authorities. The silver would be applied to her palms and inner wrists, he said, places rich with nerve endings, and the burns would heal slowly because silver poisoning interfered with normal human regenerative processes, and Maya felt her stomach turn over even as she forced herself to nod understanding. The third test, the reveal, required her to demonstrate sufficient knowledge of vampire law and history to keep the secret, followed by a binding oath that would literally kill her if she ever broke it, magic woven into words that would stop her heart the moment she spoke forbidden truths to the wrong person. Dorian's voice finally roughened slightly when he reached this part, explaining that the oath was irreversible and absolute, that she would carry it for the rest of her natural life like a curse or a chain, and Maya heard herself ask what happens if I refuse the trial entirely. Dorian went very still and his eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, and he said quietly that the Covenant would assume he'd been compromised by human attachment, that they would remove her as a security threat and potentially move against him politically or violently, depending on how threatened they felt. Maya processed this slowly, understanding that running away wouldn't just endanger her, but would spark exactly the kind of political crisis that could destabilize whatever fragile peace existed in the vampire world. And the weight of that responsibility settled on her shoulders like concrete. Lucian had been sitting in the corner throughout this entire conversation, his face growing progressively more anguished, and his hands moved in repetitive signs that Maya could read even from across the room. This is my fault. This is my fault. Over and over, until Dorian finally looked at him and signed, "Stop blaming yourself," with sharp, frustrated movements. But Lucian just shook his head and signed back. If I wasn't broken, none of this would be happening. And Maya watched Dorian flinch like he'd been struck before he turned back to his clinical explanation of trial procedures. By 3 p.m., Maya's head was pounding from information overload, and Dorian had finally dismissed her to rest before the next preparation session, and she'd retreated to her room to stare at the ceiling and try not to think about silver burns and magical compulsion and oaths that could kill her for speaking. She must have dozed because she woke to shouting in the hallway, Marcus's voice raised in alarm, and Dorian's responding with sharp commands, and by the time she got downstairs, the entire security team was mobilized and searching the grounds. Lucian had run, left a note in careful handwriting that said, "If I'm gone, they'll leave her alone. I won't let her suffer for my happiness." And Maya felt something crack in her chest reading those words because this boy was trying to save her by destroying himself. They found him at the estate gates 2 hours later, Dorian arriving first and approaching his son slowly in the gathering darkness. And Maya watched from a security feed as father and son faced each other in the fog. Dorian's hands started moving in signs, but they were shaking so badly he had to stop and switch to speaking aloud, his voice carrying clearly through the microphone on the gate camera. "I have been a coward," he said. "I isolated you not to protect you, but because I didn't know how to face your difference. I didn't know how to accept that my son experiences the world in ways I cannot fully understand, and my fear of your vulnerability became your prison." Lucian's hands moved in response, signing, "You're doing it again, protecting me by controlling everything around me." And Maya saw Dorian actually stagger backward, like the words had physical force. The fog swirled around them, and Dorian moved closer, knelt in the gravel so he was at eye level with his son, and asked in a voice Maya had never heard from him before, raw and uncertain, "What do you want, Lucian, really want? Not what I think you need, but what you actually want." Lucian's hands moved slowly, deliberately, signing, "I want Maya to choose, really choose, not be forced because of covenant politics or your guilt or my loneliness. I want her to have the freedom you never gave me." Maya watched Dorian's face crumple on the screen and turned away because witnessing this felt like intruding on something too private for observation. And she understood that she was watching a man confront his deepest failure as a father and come out the other side changed. The house settled into uneasy quiet after Dorian and Lucian came back inside, the two of them disappearing into Dorian's private quarters for a conversation Maya wasn't privy to, and she spent the evening in her room trying to read the vampire law texts Marcus had provided, but finding her mind wandering to Dorian's face on that security feed, the way he'd knelt in gravel and asked his son what he wanted. At 11:47 p.m. there was a soft knock on her door, and Maya opened it to find Dorian standing in the hallway, looking more uncertain than she'd ever seen him, and he asked if he could come in with a formality that would have been funny if the moment weren't so weighted. She stepped back, and he entered her room for what she realized was probably the first time he'd entered a woman's private space in a century, his eyes taking in her scattered law books and half-packed suitcase, and the photos she'd taped to the mirror of her mother and Jess and her old life. He stood near the window and seemed to gather himself before speaking, and when he did, his voice was careful and controlled. "I'm offering you an escape," he said. "I'll tell the Covenant you were merely an employee, that Marcus exaggerated your role in my household out of excessive caution. I'll take the political consequences and you can leave tonight with a year's salary and my protection from a distance." Maya felt her breath catch because this was everything she'd wanted 3 days ago, safety and money and freedom, but Dorian was still talking. "I'll hire a signing tutor for Lucian through proper channels," he said. "Someone vetted by the Covenant who can teach him without triggering political complications. You'll be safe, and Lucian will survive, and I will endure as I always have." Maya looked at him standing backlit by moonlight and asked, "Why are you offering this?" And Dorian's control cracked just slightly. "Because Lucien is right," he said. "I've been making choices for people I claim to protect for centuries, deciding what's best without asking what they want. I won't do that to you, Maya. I won't force you into danger because I need what you give my son." She studied his face and saw past the king to the exhausted man underneath. Saw the genuine care in his eyes, and the way his hands were clenched at his sides, like he was physically restraining himself from reaching for her. And she asked, "What do you want, Dorian? What do you actually want?" The silence stretched long enough that Maya thought he wouldn't answer, and when he finally spoke, his voice had gone rough. "I want you to stay," he said. "I want my son to keep laughing the way he does when you sign with him. I want to hear you argue with Marcus at breakfast about vampire history you learned 5 minutes ago. I want to watch you move through my house like you belong here. I want— And he stopped abruptly like the confession had escaped without permission. Maya felt her heart hammering and made herself ask the question she needed answered. What do you want from me specifically, she said. Not what I give Lucian, but what you want for yourself. Dorian turned to face her fully, and his eyes were bright with unshed tears, and something that looked like desperate hope. What I want is irrelevant, he said. I'm offering you freedom and safety. What I want doesn't matter. But it does, Maya said, and she was moving toward him before she'd consciously decided to, and when she stopped a foot away, she could see his chest rising and falling with breaths he didn't technically need. If I stay, it's not as your employee anymore, she said. It's not even for Lucian. Not entirely. Dorian's voice came out barely above a whisper when he asked then why, and Maya let herself say the truth she'd been avoiding for days. Because you cried when you saw your son happy, she said. Because you're offering to let me go, even though it costs you everything. Because I don't think anyone has ever chosen you, Dorian. They obey you and fear you and use you but choose you, just you as a person and not as a king or a resource. Has anyone ever done that? Dorian's composure shattered completely, and he turned to the window, pressing both hands against the glass hard enough that she heard it creak, and his shoulders shook with silent sobs that he was clearly trying to control. When he spoke again, his voice was wrecked. If you stay and fail the trial, I will break the covenant before I let them touch you, he said. Do you understand what I'm saying? I will start a war. I will burn down everything I've built for 3 centuries. I will become the monster they've always feared I might be. Maya moved to stand beside him at the window and said, Then we'd better make sure I pass. And Dorian made a sound that was half laugh and half sob. He turned to look at her, and his face was wet with tears and completely unguarded, and Maya saw him fully for the first time. Not the vampire king, but just a man who'd been alone for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to be chosen. She asked him to teach her the vampire sign for I choose you, and watched his hands shake as he formed the sign slowly, deliberately, a gesture that combined elements of binding and freedom in a way that was uniquely beautiful. Maya copied the sign, and Dorian's breath caught, and they stood there in moonlight with the weight of everything unsaid hanging between them, and Maya understood that she was in love with him and terrified of him and choosing him anyway, choosing all of it. The danger and the politics, and the boy who needed her, and the man who was looking at her like she was something miraculous. The moment stretched and held, and finally Dorian stepped back, putting careful distance between them, and said he should let her rest before the final preparation sessions tomorrow. Maya nodded and he moved toward the door, and just before he left he turned back and said thank you for choosing us, his voice soft and wondering, and then he was gone. And Maya was alone with her racing heart, and the knowledge that she'd just committed to a trial that might kill her for people she'd known less than a week. Sleep didn't come easy, and when dawn broke gray and cold on November 13th, Maya was already awake, staring at the ceiling and running through everything Dorian had taught her about covenant law. She heard raised voices from downstairs around 6 a.m. and found herself moving toward the sound, drawn by some instinct that said this was important. Marcus and Dorian were in the security office, and Marcus's voice was louder than Maya had ever heard it, arguing that Dorian was compromised and his feelings for the human were clouding his judgment. Maya stopped outside the door, hidden but listening, and heard Marcus say he'd sent word to the Covenant that Dorian might be unfit to lead, that his attachment to a human was making him vulnerable to manipulation and poor strategic choices. The betrayal in those words hit Maya like a physical blow, and she pressed against the wall, listening to Dorian's response. You're attempting a coup, Dorian said, his voice deadly quiet. I could have you executed for this. You know the law. But instead, his voice shifted to something that sounded almost like grief, and he asked, When did you stop trusting me, Marcus? The silence that followed was heavy enough to suffocate in, and Marcus finally answered when you started crying in public, when you let a human see you weak, when you forgot that kings cannot afford to feel. Maya heard Dorian's sharp intake of breath and then footsteps, and she barely managed to get around the corner before Marcus emerged, looking satisfied and cold. She waited until he was gone before entering the security office, finding Dorian standing among the screens and hard surfaces with his face in his hands, and when he looked up and saw her, his expression cycled through shock and embarrassment before settling into resignation. "You heard," he said, and it wasn't a question. Maya nodded and moved to stand beside him, looking at the security feeds showing the estate grounds in cold morning light, and she said, "Marcus is wrong. Feeling isn't weakness." Dorian laughed bitterly and said, "Tell that to the Covenant Council in 36 hours. Tell them that their king cries over human kindness and see how long I remain king." Maya turned to face him and said, "I don't care about them. I care about you and Lucian and making sure we all survive this." Dorian looked at her like she'd said something in a language he barely remembered, and he reached out slowly to touch her face, his hand cold and gentle against her cheek. "We will survive this," he said. "I promise you that, whatever it costs." Maya leaned into his touch for just a moment before stepping back because they both knew this couldn't go further, not yet. Not until after the trial when the political landscape had shifted, and they knew whether she'd live through the next 2 days. The house felt different after that, weighted with Marcus's betrayal and the ticking clock toward the Covenant trial, and Maya spent the day in final preparations while Dorian handled the political maneuvering required to enter the trial with enemies in his own household. And when night fell on November 13th, Maya lay in bed signing, "I choose you," over and over until her hands cramped, practicing the gesture Dorian had taught her, like a prayer or a promise. Knowing that in less than 30 hours she would face silver and fire and magical compulsion for the chance to stay with a family she'd chosen and who'd chosen her back. The vault beneath Chicago City Hall smelled like old blood and silver and stone that had never seen sunlight, and Maya's breath came out in visible clouds as she descended the iron stairs behind Dorian at exactly 8 p.m. on November 14th, her burned arm throbbing beneath the bandage she'd wrapped it in after this morning's final preparation session. The space had been a bank vault in the 1920s and still retained that sense of containment and security, walls 3 feet thick and a ceiling reinforced with iron beams that made Maya feel like she was being buried alive. Gas lamps provided the only light because electricity was forbidden in Covenant formal proceedings, some tradition about maintaining connection to older ways, and the flickering flames cast shadows that moved like living things across stone walls. 7 council members sat in elevated chairs arranged in a semicircle, looking down at the circle of salt on the floor where Maya understood she would stand for judgment, and their faces were uniformly cold and assessing, predators evaluating potential prey. Marcus stood to the right of Dorian's chair, his face carefully neutral, but Maya caught the gleam of satisfaction in his eyes and knew he was anticipating her failure. Lucian had been forbidden from attending, but Maya had seen him in the hallway before they descended, his hands signing, "Stay safe, come home, please come home," and she'd signed back, "I promise," even though she had no idea if she could keep that promise. Dorian guided her to the salt circle with a hand at her elbow, his touch cold through her sleeve, and he leaned close enough to whisper, "You don't have to do this. We can leave now. I'll handle the consequences." But Maya shook her head because they both knew leaving would mean war, and Lucian's isolation would become absolute, and everything they'd built in the past week would crumble. So she stepped into the circle and felt the salt activate with a prickle of magic against her skin. Counselor Voss, an ancient vampire with eyes like chips of black ice, spoke first in a voice that carried clearly, despite the vault's poor acoustics, explaining that the loyalty test would place Maya under compulsion, and she would answer all questions truthfully or face immediate rejection. A vampire elder Maya didn't recognize moved to stand at the circle's edge, and his eyes caught the lamplight, beginning to swirl with that hypnotic quality she'd read about but never experienced. And suddenly Maya felt hooks in her mind dragging words to the surface whether she wanted them there or not. "Why did you come to Thornwood Estate?" the elder asked, and Maya heard herself answer. "I came for the money. I was being evicted and drowning in student debt, and $200,000 would solve all my problems." The council members shifted slightly, exchanging glances, and Voss asked, "Why did you stay after learning the danger?" Maya felt the compulsion tighten, and the words came out raw and honest. "I stayed because Lucian deserves someone who chooses to be there, and because Dorian offered me freedom when he could have demanded loyalty, and because I've never felt like I mattered to anyone the way I matter to them." The elder's eyes swirled deeper, and he asked, "Do you love the king?" And Maya wanted to resist, but couldn't, the truth spilling out before she could stop it. "I love what he's trying to become," she said. "I love that he's learning to let go of control. I love that he cries when he's overwhelmed because it means he's finally feeling after centuries of numbness. I love his son, and I love the man he is when he's with his son." Counselor Voss leaned forward, and his voice went sharp with skepticism. "Why should we believe a human chooses this life freely? You admit you came for money." Maya looked directly at Dorian and felt the compulsion loosen just enough for her to choose her words carefully. "Because I had an exit," she said. "He offered me one last night, safety and money and freedom from all of this, and I said no." One of the other counselors, a woman with silver hair, asked, "What proof can you offer of this choice?" And Maya raised her hands and signed in VSL so they would all understand. "I choose you, I choose your son, I choose this danger." The signs were deliberate and formal and binding in ways ASL wasn't, and she watched Dorian's face transform with something between grief and wonder. The compulsion released and Maya staggered slightly, the hooks in her mind withdrawing all at once, and Counselor Voss conferred briefly with the others before announcing she had passed the first test. Maya's relief lasted exactly as long as it took for a different counselor to stand and approach the circle carrying a silver brand that glowed cherry red from recent heating, explaining in a voice devoid of inflection that the pain threshold test would prove whether she could withstand torture without breaking, whether vampire secrets would be safe if she was ever captured and interrogated by human authorities or rival supernatural factions. The brand was maybe 3 inches long, a simple mark that would burn deep, and Maya was told she must hold it against her forearm for a count of 10 without crying out or she would fail. Dorian made a sound low in his throat that was almost a growl, and his hands gripped the arms of his chair hard enough that Maya heard wood splinter, but he stayed seated because interrupting would mean her automatic failure. The counselor with the brand stepped to the circle's edge and extended it toward Maya, and she forced herself to reach out with her already burned arm, the bandage removed for this test, and press the silver against her skin. The pain was immediate and catastrophic. Nothing like the preparation burns Dorian had given her, which had been terrible, but controlled. This was designed to destroy, and Maya felt her vision white out at the edges. 1, the counselor counted, and Maya bit down on her tongue hard enough to taste blood because screaming meant failure. 2, and the silver was burning deeper. She could smell her own flesh cooking. 3, and tears were streaming down her face, but she kept silent. 4, and her knees started to buckle. 5, and she was shaking so hard her teeth chattered. 6, and the world tilted sideways. 7, and everything went black as she passed out, the brand falling from nerveless fingers. Maya came to on the cold stone floor outside the circle, someone's hands on her shoulders, and she realized with horrible clarity that she'd failed. She'd only made it to 7. Dorian was standing now, his eyes completely black and his fangs fully extended, a predator barely restrained from attacking the council, and Marcus had positioned himself between Dorian and the counselors like he was preparing to defend them. Maya pushed herself up, despite the screaming agony in her arm, and her voice came out hoarse but clear. Again. The vault went absolutely silent, and every vampire in the room turned to stare at her. "You passed out," Voss said. "The test is failed." Maya shook her head and got to her feet, swaying but upright. "The rules say I must hold it for a count of 10 without crying out," she said. "They don't say I can't pass out. I didn't cry out. I want to try again." Dorian made a sound that was pure anguish, but Maya ignored him, stepping back into the circle and extending her ruined arm toward the counselor with the brand. He looked at Voss, who considered for a long moment before nodding once, and the brand was reheated until it glowed again. Maya pressed it against her arm right next to the first burn, and this time she counted with the counselor, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, the numbers becoming a mantra. 6, 7, 8, her vision tunneling but staying conscious through sheer force of will. 9, almost there. 10, and she dropped the brand and fell to her knees gasping, but she hadn't screamed. "She passes," Voss said, sounding almost impressed, and Maya allowed herself to collapse while someone wrapped her arm in clean bandages and gave her water. The third test began after a 10-minute rest period that felt like 10 seconds, and Maya stood in the circle on shaking legs while Counselor Voss recited the requirements. She must demonstrate knowledge of the Treaty of 1842 and explain how she would protect vampire secrecy, then make the binding oath that would kill her if she ever broke it. Maya had memorized the treaty's core tenets during her preparation sessions, and she recited them now, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. The treaty establishes vampire authority over supernatural affairs in North America. It prohibits revelation of vampire existence to human populations. It requires all vampires to register with regional covenant councils. It mandates that human consorts and servants be tested for loyalty and bound by magical oath. She explained her understanding of secrecy protocols, how she would deflect questions and maintain cover stories, and never ever speak the truth to anyone not already bound by covenant law. Her voice was steady, despite her pain and terror, and she finished by saying, "I understand that this secret is bigger than me, that revealing it would endanger not just vampires, but every human who loves one. I understand the weight of what I'm promising." Voss nodded and produced a rolled parchment, beginning to read the oath's formal words. But before Maya could repeat them, Marcus stood from his position beside Dorian's chair. "I invoke right of challenge," Marcus said, his voice ringing clear in the vault's acoustics, and Maya felt her stomach drop because this was not part of the plan. Marcus moved to stand before the council and made his case in clinical, devastating terms. "This human has made our king emotionally unstable," he said. "She has caused him to cry in public and make rash decisions and prioritize his personal feelings over covenant stability. She is a threat not through malice, but through the very attachment she has created. I demand she be rejected for the good of our people." Dorian was standing now, his voice lethal. "You overstep, Marcus." But Voss held up one hand and said, "Right of challenge is covenant law. Once invoked, the council must vote. You cannot override this king." Maya watched the council members confer, watched them glance at her burned arm and Dorian's furious face, and Marcus's satisfied expression, and when Voss called for the vote, she already knew. 4 councillors raised their hands in favor of rejection, 3 against, and Voss announced that by majority decision, Maya had failed the trial and must submit to memory wipe or execution within 24 hours. The words landed like blows, and Maya felt her knees go weak, felt the careful control she'd maintained through torture finally cracking. And she looked at Dorian and saw his face had gone absolutely cold. All emotion locked down into something harder and more dangerous than anything she'd seen from him. "I invoke sovereign override," Dorian said, his voice cutting through the vault like a blade. "She is under my personal protection." Counselor Chen, a stern woman who'd voted for rejection, leaned forward and said, "Override requires you to claim her formally as consort and accept full responsibility for her actions. If she breaks secrecy, you abdicate the throne and accept exile. Do you understand the terms?" Dorian didn't hesitate. I accept. And Maya felt the weight of what he was sacrificing crash over her because he was choosing her over 8 centuries of rule, choosing love over power in front of the very council that would tear him apart for that weakness. Marcus made a sound of pure disbelief and said, "My king, you would throw away 8 centuries of rule for a human who's known you 1 week." Dorian turned to face his former advisor, and his voice when he spoke was soft and final. "No. I would throw it away for my son's happiness and my own. Something you have never understood, Marcus." The vault's temperature seemed to drop further, and Voss said very well, "The override is accepted. But the consort bond must be sealed before this council as witness." Maya stepped out of the salt circle on trembling legs, and Dorian moved to meet her halfway, and she understood what sealing meant before anyone explained it. Understood that he would kiss her here in this freezing vault in front of 7 vampires who wanted her dead, and one who'd betrayed them both. Dorian's hands cupped her face with devastating gentleness, and he leaned close enough that she could see the single tear tracking down his cheek, silver in the gaslight, and he whispered, "I'm sorry it has to be like this." Then he kissed her, and it wasn't romantic or gentle, it was defiant and claiming and desperate, his lips cold against hers, and his hands shaking where they touched her face. Maya kissed him back and tasted his tear, and felt something click into place in her chest, some bond she couldn't name forming between them. And when they broke apart, the council was silent, and Marcus had turned away. "The consort bond is sealed," Voss announced, and his voice held a note of something that might have been pity or might have been anticipation. He leaned toward Counselor Chen and whispered something Maya shouldn't have been able to hear, but somehow did in the vault's strange acoustics. "He'll fall within the year. Love makes kings weak." Dorian helped Maya up the iron stairs and out of the vault, and they emerged into Chicago's November night, with Marcus following at a distance, and Maya's arms screaming agony and the weight of the consort bond settling around her shoulders like chains or wings, she couldn't tell which. The car ride back to Thornwood was silent except for Maya's occasional gasps of pain when they hit bumps, and Dorian held her unbandaged hand the entire way, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm that might have been apology or promise. When they arrived, Lucian was waiting in the foyer, having clearly watched everything on some illegal security feed, and he threw himself at Maya, signing, "Are you okay? Are you hurt? I'm so sorry." And Maya signed back with her good hand. "I'm fine. I'm staying. I chose to stay." Lucian looked at his father and signed, "You claimed her as consort." And Dorian signed back yes, and Lucian's face transformed into something between joy and understanding as he signed, "You love her." Dorian didn't answer, but his hand tightened on Maya's, and that was answer enough. And the three of them stood in the foyer of Thornwood Estate, having won and lost simultaneously, having survived the trial but at a cost that would reshape everything. And Maya realized that she was bound now by magic and choice to this family and this dangerous world, and this man who'd cried when she signed to his son and cried again when he kissed her to save her life. Maya woke to filtered sunlight and the unfamiliar weight of silk sheets, her burned arm throbbing with a deep ache that told her the pain medication was wearing off. And it took her a disoriented moment to remember where she was, and why Dorian's bedroom looked different in daylight than it had at 3 a.m., when the vampire healer had finally finished treating her burns and declared she would heal but scar. Dorian stood at the window watching dawn break over Chicago through UV-filtered glass that turned the light soft and golden, and he was so still he might have been a statue, except for the slight rise and fall of his chest, breathing out of habit rather than necessity. Maya pushed herself up carefully, her arm protesting the movement, and Dorian turned immediately at the sound, crossing to the bed in 2 swift strides to check her bandages with gentle hands. The bedroom was surprisingly simple for a king, just a large bed and books stacked on every available surface, and one painting on the wall that looked old enough to be genuinely priceless. A landscape rendered in oils that had the particular quality of light she associated with old masters. "How are you feeling?" Dorian asked, his voice rough like he'd been awake all night thinking, and Maya managed a smile that felt more real than she expected. Sore, she said, but alive, that counts for something. Dorian sat on the edge of the bed and took her unbandaged hand, studying her fingers like they held answers to questions he didn't know how to ask, and when he spoke his voice was quiet and uncertain. "I've never chosen love over duty before," he said. "I've ruled for 8 centuries, and every decision has been calculated for maximum political advantage, and now I'm terrified I made the wrong choice, not for myself but for you and Lucian." Maya watched emotions play across his face, vulnerability and fear and something that looked almost like wonder, and she understood that he was asking for reassurance that she'd chosen freely, that he hadn't somehow coerced her through circumstance or supernatural influence or the sheer weight of his need. She thought about how to explain and found herself talking about her father instead, about how he'd had a stroke when she was 12 and lost his ability to speak, how frustrated he'd been trying to communicate through gestures and broken sounds until Maya had learned ASL and taught him fingerspelling. "He died 2 years later," she said, "but those 2 years we could actually talk, really talk. Not just about practical things, but about feelings and dreams and stupid jokes. And he taught me that communication isn't about words. It's about showing up and trying even when it's hard." Dorian's hand tightened on hers and she continued. "You've been trying with Lucian for 200 years. You just didn't know how. You kept showing up even when you didn't know what to say or sign. That's love, Dorian. That's what love looks like." His composure cracked completely, and he made a sound that was half sob, half laugh, and then he was crying in earnest. Real shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and long denied. Not the single tear of their first meeting or the vault, but genuine grief for 2 centuries of failure and loneliness and trying. Maya pulled him close despite her injured arm and held him while he broke apart, his face pressed against her shoulder and his whole body trembling. And she understood that this was probably the first time anyone had held him while he cried in centuries, the first time he'd allowed himself to be this vulnerable with another person. They stayed like that until the sun rose fully and the light shifted from gold to white, until Dorian's sobs quieted to shaky breaths, and he pulled back to look at her, with a face still wet and completely unguarded. "I don't know how to be a consort's partner," he said. "I've only ever been a king." Maya brushed tears from his cheeks and said, "Then, don't be my king, be my partner. Let me argue with you, and be wrong sometimes, and choose you every day, not just once in a vault." Dorian kissed her then, soft and tentative like he was afraid she'd disappear. And Maya kissed him back, tasting salt, and something sweeter, feeling the consort bond hum between them like a living thing. They eventually made their way downstairs to the breakfast room, where Lucian was already waiting, anxiety written clearly on his face, until he saw them enter together, and his expression transformed into relief. Marcus had been removed from the estate overnight, exiled rather than executed, which Lucian signed was the first act of mercy fathers shown in decades, and Maya understood that Dorian was already changing in ways that would ripple through the covenant. The breakfast room was all windows and morning light, informal and warm in ways the formal dining room never was. And Maya found herself seated between Dorian and Lucian, with coffee and toast she wasn't sure she could eat, while her stomach was still tight with residual fear. Lucian's hands moved in a question directed at Maya. "Are you staying because you have to now, or because you want to?" And Maya saw the real worry behind the casual signing, his fear that the consort bond was just another prison. She signed back "want to," emphatic and clear, and watched tension drain from Lucian's shoulders. He smiled and signed good, because father needs more people who argue with him, and Dorian made a sound of mock offense before signing back, "I'm sitting right here, I can see what you're saying." The easy teasing felt like a miracle after the vault's horror, and Maya allowed herself to relax slightly, to believe that maybe they actually would be okay. She remembered something she'd been thinking about during the sleepless hours before dawn and signed, "Wait, I want to show you something." Her hands moved carefully, creating a new sign she'd been developing, a gesture that combined elements of choice and family and permanence in a way that didn't exist in either ASL or VSL. "This is chosen family," she said aloud while signing. "I made it up. I thought we needed it." Lucian's eyes went wide and he copied the gesture immediately, his movements precise and wondering, and Dorian followed more slowly, his hands less certain but trying. They practiced it together, all three of them at the breakfast table with morning light streaming through the windows, hands moving in unison through this new sign that meant everything they'd become to each other. Maya watched Dorian's face as he signed chosen family and saw him smile, really smile, the kind of expression that transformed his entire face from remote and beautiful to warm and human. Lucien signed it again and again, adding flourishes, clearly delighted by the concept, and Maya felt something settle in her chest that might have been peace, or might have been belonging, or might have been both. The moment held perfect and bright until movement outside the window caught Maya's attention. A black car with Covenant diplomatic plates pulling up to the estate gates, and she felt her stomach clench with renewed anxiety. Dorian followed her gaze, and his expression shifted back toward the king, controlled and assessing, but when he looked at Maya, his eyes were soft. "They'll keep testing us," he said. "The Covenant doesn't accept change easily." Maya signed back. "Let them. I passed their trial, now they'll pass mine." And Lucian laughed at her audacity. Dorian reached for Maya's hand and signed to Lucian with his other. "I'm sorry I let you be alone so long." And Lucian's response was immediate. "You're not alone anymore either. None of us are." The car at the gate disgorged two vampires in formal dress who approached the front door with the bearing of diplomats. And Maya knew this was just the beginning, that the Covenant would keep pushing and testing and trying to break what they'd built. But she looked at Dorian's face and saw determination instead of the isolated grief she'd seen that first night at the Meridian, looked at Lucian and saw a boy who was finally connected to the world instead of trapped behind silence, and she understood that they'd already won the fight that mattered. The doorbell rang and Dorian squeezed Maya's hand before standing to face whatever new challenge waited. But before he left the breakfast room, he turned back and signed chosen family, the gesture still uncertain but gaining confidence, and Maya signed it back. Lucian stayed at the table with Maya, while Dorian went to deal with the Covenant diplomats, and he signed, "You know they're going to keep coming, more challenges and more tests and more political maneuvering." Maya signed back, "I know, but we're stronger together than they expect. They think love makes us weak, but it makes us willing to fight." Lucian considered this and signed, "You really love him, don't you?" And Maya found herself nodding before she'd consciously decided to answer. "I do," she signed. "I love him, and I love you, and I love this weird, impossible family we're building." Lucian's smile was bright enough to rival the morning sun, and he signed, "I'm glad you stayed. I'm glad you chose us." Through the window, Maya could see Dorian on the front steps talking to the Covenant diplomats, his posture formal and controlled, every inch the king, but she knew what he looked like when that control cracked, knew the sound of his sobs and the taste of his tears and the way his hands shook when he signed chosen family. The scar on her arm throbbed under its bandages, a permanent mark of the choice she'd made in that vault. And she traced the bandage edge while watching Dorian negotiate whatever new political crisis had arrived at their door. Lucian moved to stand beside her at the window and signed, "What do you think they want?" And Maya signed back, probably to test whether the consort bond is real or strategic. Lucian made a face that suggested he found Covenant politics exhausting and signed, "Well, jokes on them because it's both." And Maya had to suppress a laugh because he was absolutely right. The diplomats eventually left, and Dorian returned to the breakfast room looking tired, but not defeated, and he reported that the Covenant wanted formal documentation of the consort bond, an assurance that Maya understood her new role's responsibilities. Maya asked what responsibilities exactly, and Dorian's mouth quirked in something almost like amusement as he listed representing him at certain political functions, maintaining absolute secrecy about covenant affairs, submitting to periodic loyalty verification, and accepting that her life was now permanently entangled with vampire politics. So basically what I already agreed to, Maya said, just with more paperwork and scrutiny. Dorian nodded and said, "Welcome to being a consort. It's exactly as tedious as it sounds," and Maya found herself laughing despite the ache in her arm and the weight of everything that had changed. They returned to the breakfast table, and Lucienne poured fresh coffee while signing, "You know this means you'll have to learn formal covenant etiquette. There are rules about everything from how you greet elders to what you wear to political functions." Maya groaned and signed, "I barely passed regular etiquette. Vampire etiquette sounds impossible," but Dorian signed back, "I'll teach you. We'll practice together." The casual intimacy of that promise made Maya's chest tight, the understanding that they would navigate this new world as partners, learning together, and she signed chosen family again, just to watch both Dorian and Lucian's faces light up. The morning stretched into afternoon, and Maya's arm pain medication wore off enough that Dorian insisted she rest, guiding her back upstairs to his bedroom, because apparently consorts were expected to share the king's private quarters. Maya had barely processed that implication before exhaustion hit, and she was asleep almost before her head touched the pillow. And when she woke hours later, the sun was setting, and Dorian was back at the window, watching twilight paint the sky purple and gold. She watched him from the bed, this man who'd been a king for 8 centuries, and was learning to be something softer, something more human. And she understood that the real story wasn't the dramatic trial or the political maneuvering, but these quiet moments of choosing each other over and over. Dorian turned and caught her watching, and his smile was small but genuine as he crossed to sit beside her. "How's your arm?" he asked, and Maya flexed it carefully under the bandages. "Hurts," she said, "but the healer said it's healing clean. I'll just have an impressive scar." Dorian traced the edge of the bandage with gentle fingers and said, "I'm sorry you bear that mark because of me," and Maya caught his hand and said, "I'm not. It's proof I chose this, chose you, chose all of it." His eyes went bright with unshed tears, and he leaned down to kiss her forehead, her cheeks, her mouth, soft brushes of cold lips that made her shiver. They stayed like that until full dark fell and the estate's security lights activated, until Lucian knocked tentatively on the door to ask if they were coming down for dinner, and Maya realized with a start that this was her life now, this beautiful, complicated, dangerous family in this fortress estate with its covenant politics and vampire etiquette, and a boy who needed her, and a man who loved her. Dinner was quiet and easy. Just the three of them at the informal table practicing the chosen family sign until it felt natural, until their hands moved in unison without conscious thought, and Maya understood that they were building something new here, something that didn't fit covenant expectations or traditional vampire hierarchy, but belonged to them anyway. After dinner, Lucian taught Maya and Dorian a card game he'd learned from one of the estate staff, something complicated involving strategy and bluffing, and they played until midnight while rain started pattering against the windows. Maya caught Dorian cheating twice and called him out both times, and his expression of mock innocence made Lucian laugh so hard he had to sign, "Stop, I can't breathe, you're supposed to be dignified." Dorian signed back, "Dignity is overrated. I'm learning to have fun instead." And Maya felt her heart expand in her chest because this was what she'd fought for in that vault, this lightness and laughter and belonging. Eventually, exhaustion caught up with all of them, and Lucian headed to his own room while Dorian and Maya returned upstairs, and Maya changed into borrowed pajamas, while Dorian disappeared into his study to handle some urgent covenant correspondence. She was nearly asleep when he returned and slipped into bed beside her, cold skin against warm, and Maya turned into his embrace without thinking. "Thank you," he whispered into her hair, "for choosing us, for seeing past what I am to who I'm trying to become." Maya pressed closer and said, "Thank you for letting me." for trusting me with your son and your tears and your heart. They fell asleep tangled together as dawn approached. And Maya's last conscious thought was of the chosen family sign, three sets of hands moving in perfect unison, building something new from broken pieces and unexpected grace. The next morning brought more covenant correspondence and the beginning of Maya's formal etiquette training, and a phone call from her mother that Maya had to carefully navigate without revealing anything about vampires or consort bonds or trials that left scars. But through it all, she and Dorian and Lucian practiced their new sign, chosen family, and Maya understood that whatever challenges the Covenant threw at them, they would face together, stronger for having chosen each other not once, but continuously. Every day, a new decision to stay and fight and love and build this impossible, beautiful family that shouldn't exist but did anyway.